Well, welcome to 10-Minute Record Reviews, episode 416. And this time I'm going to talk about this record by the John Coltrane Quartet, Crescent, which came out on Impulse Records in 1964. I have an extremely unexciting 1970s reissue with a green label on wobbly, thin vinyl, and I encourage you, if you're going to get this record, to find something a bit older or a bit newer. This is a record with an underdeveloped reputation. It suffers, I think, from being the record which came immediately before A Love Supreme, and standing next to the majesty of that release, any record is going to suffer a little bit and stand in the shade. If you spend a few idle moments online looking for lists of Coltrane's greatest records, you'll find that it's excluded from those lists as often as it's included. In Ashley Kahn's book about Impulse Records, The House That Train Built, it barely gets mentioned. Bob Thiele produced Coltrane all the way through the 1960s, and in his autobiography, it's mentioned only in passing. And Lewis Porter's biography of Coltrane basically ignores it. Now, I understand why this is, because all three of them spend lots of time talking about A Love Supreme. But that means that a very, very good jazz record has basically been remaindered thanks to critical inattention. So I'm making this video to encourage you to pay attention to Crescent and give it a listen, not only because it's an excellent record, but also because of its many examples of the most important strains of Coltrane's career. John Coltrane's first years at Impulse Records were full of compromise, or maybe that's the wrong term. Maybe it would be fairer to say that they were characterized by a lot of give and take. Certainly, both Creed Taylor, who signed him to the label in 1961, and Bob Thiele, who produced him all the way through the 60s and took over from Taylor right away, both of these guys recognized him as a generational talent. But Thiele, who after a few months became responsible for the fledgling label, also had to make money. And he struck a deal with Coltrane in which he agreed with the tenor saxophonist that artistic freedom was there to be had as long as the label could get its pound of flesh from Coltrane in the form of a number of commercially accessible records. And Thiele had every reason to be anxious. Coltrane, of course, had been a big star when he was previously with Atlantic Records. He'd released great albums like My Favorite Things and Giant Steps. But Thiele's first meeting with Coltrane was actually at a recording session at the Village Vanguard. And the music was going to be debuted at the club. Thiele had not met Coltrane. He'd not heard the music. He'd not even seen charts for the music. And on top of that, Coltrane shows up with Eric Dolphy in tow as well. Now, eventually, of course, Coltrane would release records on Impulse which were both challenging records but also commercially successful, of which A Love Supreme is maybe the best example. But back in November 1961, he was still feeling his way to that sound, and he was experimenting widely in the clubs in Greenwich Village with co-conspirators like Eric Dolphy. And the untethered exploration that Coltrane and Dolphy were indulging in famously led to them being labeled as anti-jazz exponents in the pages of Downbeat. That night at the Village Vanguard, the music was anything but commercial. Thiele loved it, but he was under no illusions as to its marketability. In his autobiography, he referred to the music that Coltrane and Dolphy were producing as apocalyptic. And the suits at ABC, who owned Impulse and were therefore Thiele's boss, were pretty certain that anti-jazz wouldn't hunt. Hence the deal. Coltrane would release a number of commercial records, and in exchange, his live explorations were to be confined to the clubs and or to live recordings released on vinyl. The commercial records Coltrane and his quartet make in 1962 and 1963 include some of Coltrane's best-loved and best-selling titles, including the collaborations with Duke Ellington and Johnny Hartman, and the lovely record Ballads. But it's this record, made in the spring of 1964, which marks the point at which Impulse and Bob Thiele begin to trust Coltrane to make viable records in the studio, and Coltrane repays that trust with a remarkable LP. This record is made on April 27th and June 1st, 1964 at Rudy Van Gelder's Englewood Cliffs studio with Bob Thiele in the producer's chair. And Coltrane is, of course, joined by Elvin Jones on drums, McCoy Tyner on piano, and Jimmy Garrison on bass. It's worth, I think, talking a little bit about the compositional context of the music on here. Although Coltrane in the 1960s played a lot of pretty out there stuff, his relationship with the avant-garde jazz movement was only ever partial. He certainly experimented with it, sometimes in a wholesale way, as on Ascension, but his own evolution was also based in musical tradition and in his own spirituality. In November 1963, Coltrane was in the midst of a tour of Europe, and he was giving interviews in Paris talking about his compositional impulses. And he's telling interviewers that he wants to move in new compositional directions. He had, of course, up until quite recently, been playing a lot of modal jazz with Miles Davis. And modal jazz was jazz which rejected traditional chord progressions and was based around the notes of a single scale or sometimes even a single chord. Towards the end of 1963, he's now telling interviewers that he wants to write music either without a tonal center at all, or music which moves between a modal approach and true atonality. So if you read this, you think, okay, that takes him clearly in an avant-garde free jazz trajectory, but that was only part of the story. He was also increasingly interested in long compositions, compositions which were devotional or spiritual in nature, compositions based on poems, either real or imagined. And on top of these impulses, he had other influences as well. He had recently fallen in love with Alice MacLeod and was divorcing his first wife, Naima. He was experimenting frequently with Dolphy, and he'd also settled on the lineup of what we now call his classic quartet, with Elvin Jones, McCoy Tyner, and Jimmy Garrison. These were no ordinary musicians, and they were bringing as much out of Coltrane as he was bringing out of them, and taking him, driving him, frankly, to new heights in performance. And if that sounds like Coltrane had a lot of things going on in his head at the same time, things which didn't necessarily all line up together, I'd say you were right. He's got all these influences and all these aspirations, and where does he go with all of this? It's a lot, even if you're a musical genius. His compositions in the winter of 1963-64 include Crescent, The Drum Thing, Bessie's Blues, and Wise One, 4 of the 5 tracks on here. The other track, Lonnie's Lament, had been written the previous year and had been trotted out on tour during that fall tour of Europe in November '63. Taken together, these 5 tracks represent many different strands of Coltrane's gifts. The title track, I think, shows Coltrane at his assertive best. You've got sheets of sound, you've got overblowing, you've got multiphonics, you've got split tones, all interwoven with more introverted and introspective passages. Wise One, written as a tribute to his soon-to-be ex-wife Naima, is a close foreshadowing of the spirituality and the feel of a love supreme, or certainly parts of it. By contrast, Lonnie's Lament and The Drum Thing are examples of Coltrane basically giving space to these remarkable musicians that he counted in his band. And Bessie's Blues is one of the last 4-on-the-floor hard bop numbers that the band ever recorded, and basically showed that the band could still rock. Side 1 starts with Crescent, the title track, and this to me is one of the greatest tracks the quartet ever laid down. And as much as Coltrane's playing is wonderful, it's brilliant and edgy, I talked about it just now, I actually find myself drawn more, as I listen to it over time, to the supportive playing of his bandmates, in particular Elvin Jones. I'm always amazed at how much Elvin Jones does, while paradoxically never doing too much. He, I think, is maybe the biggest reason why nobody ever sounded like them. Next is Wise One, which has this lovely, unhurried intro. Well, the first part of it anyway is all Coltrane. And for all his technical mastery and his lightning speed, there's a case to be made that he was also the greatest slow-tempo saxophonist ever to pick up a horn. On this track, there's also a lovely mid-tempo section, which in theory is a Tyner solo, but is actually a bit of an exercise in trio egalitarianism. And the final track on side 1, Bessie's Blues, is, as I mentioned, a fairly straightforward piece of hard bop, except that McCoy Tyner never plays straightforward blues lines when he's playing the blues. Side 2 begins with Lonnie's Lament, much loved, much covered. It's a gorgeous ballad. It recalls the mood of that ballads record, and it's also the setting for one of Jimmy Garrison's longest ever solos. Side 2 really is a playground for Coltrane's sidemen, and The Drum Thing is a party piece for Elvin Jones, although Garrison and Coltrane both make lovely contributions at points. This record may not be as consistently commercial and accessible as the Ellington collaboration or as ballads. It may not be a spiritual mountaintop to compete with Love Supreme, but this record, perhaps uniquely in his catalog, offers almost the full sweep of what he was capable of bringing. In addition, one of the most attractive things about this record is its humility. It's not just about Coltrane. In fact, of all his records on Impulse, this one, probably most of all, is about the band. Whether you find it to be a good record or a great record will depend, I think, on your tolerance for extended bass and drum solos. But for me, I find it to be a necessary component of even a modest collection of Coltrane's records, and I would say a must-have from his Impulse years. And for me, it's 4.5 out of 5 stars.